And we continue our series of lectures on the dual process perspective in persuasion with this second lecture, which basically presents the general dual process framework along with the leading dual process theory of persuasion, the Elaboration Likelihood Model. Remember that we've defined persuasion as a subset of social influence whereby a message source attempts to create, reinforce, or change the attitudes, values, beliefs, or behaviors of one or more recipients. And in particular, we're trying to answer the question, how is persuasion possible? From our last lecture, if you remember, there are multiple source factors, message factors, and recipient factors that influence persuasion. In general, when the source is credible, likable, and similar to the recipient, and presents strong arguments that don't diverge too much from the recipient's original attitude, then attitude change is more likely. So you're more likely to be persuaded about the benefits of yoga from the person on the right as opposed to the person on the left. And when messages are structured in ways to include strong evidence, like logic, particular organizational schemes, and so forth, your attitudes are also more likely to be changed. And advertisers are well aware that we're often persuaded by elements that have little to nothing to do with the product under consideration, and that sometimes it takes a lot of information to move certain people. So the picture to the left is an advertisement for a particular fast food chain. Clearly nothing in the advertisement other than the fact that the food chain's bag and symbol are there. Nothing really has anything to do with the quality of the food, whereas this advertisement over to the right has lots and lots of arguments and evidence and appeal in words rather than in images that should move the customer to purchase. The dual process perspective is driven by a central motto that states to understand how persuasion works, we have to understand both the nature of the persuasive communication and the nature of human information processing. In other words, the reason that certain source and message factors influence attitudes is because of the ways in which persuasive communication, the elements that are embedded in advertisements and other forms of persuasive appeals, is processed in the minds of recipients. The dual processing perspective represents a variety of often disconnected theories that share one thing in common. Dual process theories propose that human behavior, including communication, is the combined result of two qualitatively different processing mechanisms, which employ different procedures and may yield different and sometimes conflicting results. These theories have been developed in the contexts of human learning, memory, reasoning, decision-making, and the processing of both persuasive communication and supportive communication, as well as other forms of communication. The first time the term dual process was used in print is when Wasson and Evans reported some unexpected results of their 4-card test. So basically this selection task, or the 4-card problem, is a logic puzzle that was developed by Wasson in 1966. An example of the puzzle is as follows. You're shown a set of 4 cards placed on a table, each of which has a number on one side and a colored patch on the other side. The visible faces of the cards show 3, 8, red, and brown, like is shown on the slide. Which cards must you turn over in order to test the truth of the proposition that if a card shows an even number on one face, then its opposite face is red? And the correct response to this problem is that you turn over only the 8 and the brown cards. The rule is if the card shows an even number on one face, then its opposite face is red. Only a card with both an even number on one face and something other than red on the other face can validate this rule. So if the 3 card is red or brown, that doesn't violate the rule. If the 8 card is brown, that does violate the rule. If the red card is odd or even, then it doesn't violate the rule. And if the brown card is even, that does violate the rule. All right, so the importance of the experiment isn't the color of the card or the whether it's odd or even, but that how the participants justify the answer that they give and how they're able to state explicitly their reasoning procedures about what they're doing. So if we can demonstrate the inconsistency of applying logical rules by people when the problem is set in 2 different contexts, but with very similar connections between the facts, then there's a puzzle to be solved and a theory that's needed to solve that puzzle. Subjects in the original experiment were asked to provide a rule. For example, if a card has an even number on one side and its opposite side is red, by flipping over the least amount of the 4 cards. And one might expect that regardless of whether or not they were correct in their card selections, that they would be able to accurately articulate the rationale or the reasons for their choice. They would be able to explain their reasoning. As it turned out, however, subjects were not able to fully explain their reasoning. Watson and Evans discovered a matching bias by which subjects would match their card selections to the instructions they were given, but not seem to be aware of this when they were asked to justify their card selection. And because neither of the prevailing explanations of the day could account for that result, Watson and Evans proposed what they called the dual process hypothesis, that 2 qualitatively different processes were at work. One process is intuitive and one is rational. Furthermore, both combine to account for reasoning, but only the rational processing could be subjectively experienced and recounted as a reason for behavioral choice. In a similar fashion, dual process theories have developed in other areas of social psychology and cognitive psychology, such as the study of learning and decision making, as well as in the realm of person perception, stereotyping, attitude change, and a variety of other specific contexts. Early theory-building efforts were focused on specific phenomena, meaning that any given theory was focused on explaining only one domain of cognitive or social information processing. Interestingly, those domain-specific theories also developed largely independently. And so you have a variety of theories of dual process theories of persuasion, a variety of dual process theories of attitude change, of stereotyping, of attribution, of reasoning, and so forth. And so there's a bunch of differences among the theories, but most accounts are similar to a theory proposed by Epstein called rational experiential self-theory. And in this theory, Epstein proposes several processes that he calls experiential and several processes that he calls rational. So he organizes a variety of processes under an experiential system and a set of processes under what he calls the rational system. The experiential system is an example of what many people call a type 1 system because the processes under this system are automatic, fast, high capacity, and or associative. That is, the processes are triggered unconsciously, and they work fast as opposed to slow, and they are quite resistant to change. In other words, it takes a lot to change them. The rational system is an example of a type 2 system because the processes under that system are relatively slow, limited in capacity, and or rule-based. And so dual process shouldn't be taken to suggest that there are only 2 processes underlying human information processing, but that those processes that do underlie human behavior can be classified into 2 distinct categories or 2 sets of processes. Dual process theories have become a staple of work in both cognitive and social psychology and have influenced theories of human communication at least since 1970. The goal of dual process theories is to map the cognitive processes underlying a given task, like persuasion, And in our case specifically, we're looking at attitude change. The most cited dual process theory of persuasion is the Elaboration Likelihood Model, developed in the 1970s by two folks, Richard Petty and John Cacioppo. And these folks were psychology graduate students, actually, at the time that they developed this theory. So let's suppose that you graduate and you get a job and you decide that it's time to invest in real estate. And so you're in the market for an apartment or a house, a townhome, some new sort of property. Chances are you're going to think a lot about that decision. You're going to ask yourself questions like, where should I live? Should I live close to work? Should I live close to activities I like to do on the weekend? Should I live close to a public transportation system? What sort of amenities does the building have? What sort of amenities does the neighborhood offer? How close am I to walking or running trails? How likely is it that I can sell at a profit when I'm ready in a couple of years? And so you're going to ask many questions about your purchase. That is, you're going to think a lot about centrally relevant issues. The relevant issues when buying a property differ based on the individual. So some people might care about school zones. Some people might care about walking distance to a good coffee shop. But regardless of the specifics, when you have important decisions to make, you often think a lot about those decisions. In the language of the ELM, you're engaged in a high degree of elaboration. You're thinking a lot about the central issues. This illustrates the first of the four core ideas that are embedded in the ELM. That when a person encounters some form of communication, they can process that communication with varying levels of thought, called elaboration, ranging from a low degree of thought, low elaboration, to a high degree of thought, or high elaboration. So when you have an important decision to make, you think a lot. But sometimes you don't think really all that much at all. Maybe you purchased your last pair of shoes not because they were comfortable or practical, but because they looked good or they matched your outfit. Or maybe the pair is what everyone else is wearing or what your best friend told you to buy. Sometimes we're persuaded to make purchases based on peripheral information, the look of something, like our example of the attractive actress eating the hamburger in a couple of slides ago. Other times we're persuaded to make purchases based on centrally relevant information, the rational arguments or the logic behind the decision. Because the decisions that we make can be organized into two qualitatively different categories of thinking, the ELM posits that there are two routes to persuasion. The central route that requires a high degree of elaboration, and the peripheral route that does not require much elaboration at all. The original model looked like this, and you can see the two routes represented. The central route is represented on the left side, and the peripheral route is represented on the right side. If you don't care all that much, so your likelihood of elaboration is based on this figure, and thus of persuasion operating through either the central or the peripheral route. So your likelihood of elaboration or your likelihood of going through the central or peripheral route depends on your motivation and ability to process the central merits or issues relevant to the product or to the decision at hand. If you don't care all that much, then you're not likely motivated to think much at all about the decision. As a result, elements less central and more peripheral to the issue at hand are likely to influence you. In such low elaboration situations, the presence of some peripheral cue, such as the physical attractiveness of a celebrity who endorses the product, will sway your decisions in favor of the product. Likewise, if you don't have the ability to elaborate on the central merits for or against purchasing some product, say you're distracted or you're tired or you don't know the language being used, then again, peripheral cues are likely to influence your decision. If, however, the decision is an important decision and you're fully attentive and able to process, then you're going to be persuaded primarily by the quality of arguments being presented. When people are likely to engage in a high degree of elaboration, it's important to have strong arguments. Under conditions of high elaboration, weak arguments result in negative attitude change. That is, you're more likely to make people tenaciously against the position you're advocating. So then, the important question from the ELM's perspective is, what influences motivation and ability to process? There are several individual and situational elements that influence motivation, and several individual and situational elements that influence ability. The ELM primarily focuses on one situational element of motivation, that is the personal involvement, as well as one individual difference, need for cognition. And over on the ability side, you have distraction as the situational and background knowledge as the individual component. So the main motivation variable studied to date is personal involvement. That's the degree to which the topic is relevant to you. Clearly, if you're searching for a property, a house or an apartment, then chances are the decision is highly relevant to you, and thus you're likely to be motivated to engage in elaboration, to think about that decision. A second variable thought to influence motivation is need for cognition. This is an individual difference or tendency to engage in thinking. People with a high need for cognition have greater elaboration motivation. In terms of ability, distraction has been studied most extensively. If you're distracted from elaborating on the central merits of some decision or argument, then clearly the message cannot have as much of an effect as if you weren't distracted. Similarly, if you have a great deal of background knowledge about the topic, then you have a greater ability to elaborate. The more you know about a subject, the more that you can engage in thinking about the subject. If you don't know much, you'll be less able to engage in issue-relevant thinking simply because you lack the issue-relevant knowledge to do so. So the first core idea of the elaboration likelihood model is that we are more or less likely to elaborate on information based on motivation and ability to do so. The second core idea of the elaboration likelihood model is that there are a variety of psychological processes of change that operate to varying degrees as a function of a person's level of elaboration. So if you remember, if you can go back to your notes pages and look at that slide from cognitive experiential self theory, you'll see a set of processes under the type 1 and a set of processes under the type 2 systems, the experiential and the rational systems. And the ELM posits something similar, where the peripheral route includes a bunch of low elaboration processes, whereas the central route includes a bunch of high elaboration processes. So on the lower end of the continuum are processes that require relatively little thought, including classical conditioning and mere exposure. On the higher end of the continuum are processes that require relatively more thought, including expectancy value and cognitive response processes. When lower elaboration processes predominate, a person is said to be using the peripheral route, and when predominantly high elaboration processes are operating, the person is said to be operating under the central route. The primary central route process that's tested in research using the ELM is cognitive responding. So when you're engaged in a high degree of elaboration, you're persuaded because strong arguments elicit more positive thoughts than negative thoughts about the product or the decision under consideration. When you're not persuaded and you're engaged in a high degree of elaboration, it's because many more negative thoughts than positive thoughts are generated when you think about the product or the decision. Under conditions of high elaboration, attitudes are changed based on the thoughtful consideration of issue-relevant information. When your thoughts are largely positive, your attitudes shift toward the direction advocated by a persuasive source. When your thoughts are largely negative, your attitudes do not shift, or they shift away from the direction advocated by the persuasive source. So if your recipient is motivated and able to process, you need to figure out a way to generate positive thoughts in his or her mind. Here, there are two primary ways to do that according to the ELM. The first is when the message is pro-attitudinal, when it advocates a view that the recipient is primarily favorable toward. When you do this, then it's more likely to generate in that recipient positive thoughts. When a message is counter-attitudinal, when it advocates a view that the recipient is primarily unfavorable toward, then it's more likely to generate in the recipient negative thoughts. When arguments are strong, the second argument quality here, they're likely to also generate positive thoughts. But when weak messages, when argument quality is weak, negative thoughts are more likely. So the two primary message factors that the ELM studies are pro versus counter-attitudinal messages and strong versus weak messages. Under conditions of high elaboration, these things should have more of an impact than when there is low elaboration. When there's low elaboration, recipients are not engaged in thoughtful consideration of message arguments. They're not considering the evidence or the reasoning. Instead, recipients use simple decision rules called heuristics that require little thinking. The heuristics are triggered by peripheral cues in the environment. So one such heuristic cue is that credible sources are believable. So the presence of a credible source is the peripheral cue that triggers the rule used to make a decision about whether to purchase something. In the example of you wanting to purchase a property, you might have a credible real estate agent, someone who's been in the business a long time and whom you trust. They may have been recommended by a friend, or you may have seen that they're a high producer or have high levels of satisfaction from other clients. As a result, you're more likely to believe what they say. Of course, in this situation, you are personally involved and thus are more likely to elaborate on the merits of the argument under consideration. So it should matter more what they say than who they are. In this example, while credibility may have influenced your decision to hire the person, it should have less of an effect on your decision of which property to buy compared to the arguments in favor or against specific properties. So the second idea embedded within the ELM is that there are a variety of psychological processes that can be classified as either high thinking processes, processes that take a lot of thought to generate, or low thinking processes, processes that don't require a lot of thought to generate. The third core idea of the ELM is that the degree of thought used in a persuasion context determines how consequential the resultant attitude becomes. Attitudes formed via high thought central route processes will tend to persist over time, resist persuasion, and be influential in guiding other judgments and behaviors to a greater extent than attitudes formed with low thought. So when you elaborate on the central merits of an argument, you generate thoughts that tend to be incorporated into your long-term memory about the product or about the decision. These thoughts will be harder to change than if you were merely persuaded by the attractiveness of the source or the belief or the credibility or the likability of the source. Indeed, persuasion that operates through the peripheral route is thought to be short-lived. The fourth idea, the final idea embedded within the ELM, is that any given variable can have multiple roles in persuasion. More specifically, it can affect the degree of elaboration, it can serve as a peripheral cue, or it can influence the valence of elaboration. So take the credibility of a source, for example. Source credibility can affect the degree of elaboration, can serve as a peripheral cue, or can influence the valence of elaboration. When a doctor tells you to quit smoking or to exercise more, you're more likely to listen to that advice than if someone with less credibility were to tell you these things. Because the doctor has a high degree of credibility on health issues, their credibility should make the message worth attending to. In this case, credibility serves to affect the degree of elaboration. The presence of a lab coat and a stethoscope is making it more likely that you'll attend to issue relevant information. The same cue, however, could also influence the valence of elaboration. So if you're already worried about your health, say you went to the doctor because of some set of symptoms that have persisted over several weeks, in this case, the doctor's credibility might make it more likely that you will generate positive thoughts. Sometimes, however, source credibility has little to nothing to do with the decision at hand. In these cases, credibility serves as a peripheral cue, such as the case with Anna Kournikova's endorsement of Canon's PowerShot camera. She's not an expert in photography, and her credibility is only used in this case to serve as a peripheral cue for you to make a simple and low elaboration connection between her PowerShot on the tennis court and the ability of Canon cameras to take quality pictures. So the ELM is best described as a dual route, multi-process theory. Specifically, the dual routes are ways in which attitudes change, ways in which attitude change can happen, and they differ in the degree of elaboration required for processing. The central route involves conscious processing of issue relevant information, while the peripheral route involves the processing of cues. The engagement of one route over the other route is a function of elaboration, or the extent to which an individual engages in effortful cognitive activity while processing persuasive communication. Elaboration likelihood is a function of motivation and ability, with attitudes most likely to be changed by central route processes when elaboration is high. When elaboration is low, peripheral cues are thought to influence attitude change through relatively effortless mechanisms. Although the ELM has been an influential theory, it's not without its critics. The main criticisms surround two primary questions. First, the ELM is silent with respect to what makes an argument high versus low quality. More specifically, it defines argument quality in empirical rather than in theoretical terms. So the studies that test the impact of argument quality on attitude change first conduct a pilot study that tests various messages for their ability to generate favorable versus unfavorable thoughts. So prior to the main study, the researchers generate the researchers generate a set of messages, some thought to be strong and some thought to be weak. Then they have an independent sample of participants, those that aren't going to be in the main study, read the messages and complete a thought listing task whereby they list what they were thinking while they were reading the message. The message that generates the most positive thoughts on average is then chosen to represent a strong argument, while the message that generates the most negative thoughts on average is chosen to be the representative weak argument. A second strategy very similar to this is to have participants, instead of listing their thoughts, evaluate the messages for their persuasive potential. They indicate on a scale from 1 to 10 or 1 to 9 or 0 to 5 or whatever the case might be that the message is strong or weak. And the message with the highest mean is the strong one, while the message with the lowest mean is the weak one. The problem with both of these approaches is that there's no independently motivated normative account of argument quality. That is, we don't know what factors underlie these messages, only that they generate positive versus negative thoughts, or that people perceive them to be high or low quality. But why is that? What accounts for the thoughts that are generated or the evaluations provided? Why are some arguments stronger than other arguments? Some work in communication studies has sought to answer this question, but that work pales in comparison to the work that shows how messages are processed and whether they have greater or lesser impact on outcomes as a function of elaboration likelihood. One such theory that we mentioned last time, person-centered theory, suggests that messages are stronger to the extent that they recognize and put into play more relevant goals of the message recipient. Those that are weaker only are concerned with the goals of the message producer. But in general, however, there's still a great need for strong theories of argument quality and persuasion research. The second primary critique of the ELM is related to the fact that it poses an elaboration continuum from relatively high to relatively low, but mainly studies the extremes of the continuum in the form of central and peripheral routes to attitude change. But what happens when motivation and ability are moderate? When persuasive communication is received under conditions of moderate levels of elaboration? Theoretically, both message features, like argument quality, and peripheral cues, such as credibility, should both impact attitude change under these conditions. But how do they interact? Are they additive? Is one still more important than the other? Do they interact whereby one biases the other? In other words, what's the nature of the relationship between cues and elements of messages? Questions like this are answered in a more satisfying way by a second dual process theory of attitude change, the heuristic systematic model. We're going to discuss that theory in our next lecture. Until then, remember that the ELM specifies how to use various elements of messages and peripheral cues depending on the elaboration potential of your target. So knowing your audience members' motivation and ability to process can help you tailor your persuasive attempt and be more likely to shift attitudes than if you did not know this information.